Now we're going to talk about how new technologies are raising some very basic questions about identity. These technologies are biometrics, encryption, distributed ledgers or blockchain, machine learning, or algorithmic analysis. Here I have me, my government, and the range of service providers that are interested in knowing who I am or something about me. Government is generally the basic provider of identity, but a question that is now emerging is whether identity must be linked to legal status. In the old days, when you got an identity card, that showed that you were a legal resident or a citizen. But under India's new Aadhaar program, that linkage is not there. The unique ID that you get merely proves that you're a unique individual. And whether you're a citizen or not becomes a separate matter, just like whether you're a member of Facebook is a separate matter to your inherent identity. While the government provides the basic or breeder identity, that usually needs to get translated into private IDs. These are the range of authentication factors that providers know you by, like username, phone number, password, and so on. And then there's the question of whether private providers can ever play the role of fulfilling basic identity in a way that fulfills legal KYC requirements. That's not the case right now. Ultimately, all legal identity is based on a government-issued ID, whether it's a national ID or a voting card, driver's license, or whatever. And finally, and very importantly, what are the user's rights in controlling their personal data? And given the fact that our identity is an accumulation of different personas, then what is the user's rights in controlling which identity is presented to whom? I don't need to show the same face and the same information to get admitted to a hospital as when I'm doing Facebook. A basic question that then arises through many of these issues is who owns my identity? Is it me? Is it the government who issued the breeder document? Is it the providers who issue the authentication factors? Of course, in traditional government-issued ID system, it's the government that grants you that identity. In order for you to get that identity, you need to present some uniqueness about you, maybe it's fingerprint, and maybe also some documents that show that you were born, your address, or your legal status in the country, as a citizen or not. And based on that, the government will then issue an ID, which can take the form of a card, but might also be cardless, in which case it's just a unique number that represents you. A very different approach goes under the name of self-sovereign identity, where you can think of identity being a combination of information about you that you can put in a box as your identity locker, controlled by you. Specifically, you can control who can drop information into that locker of what nature. You might drop your state-issued ID number into that locker. You might let Facebook and others drop information, which you can then use to prove certain things about yourself. The school records, or e-commerce, or even pizza delivery histories that give a track record of residing at a place. Based on that, you can grant authorization to certain players to access certain bits of information. That you are who you claim to be, a certain nationality, over a certain legal age, or that you're entitled to certain government services. This approach then is more diverse because you can have a much broader variety of personas that you can link to your own identity. It's also more granular because it can be based on very specific attributes you want to prove, not your identity as a whole, but maybe your age or your citizenship. And it's going to be much more probabilistic because any of these identities or attributes that you're trying to prove is going to be backed by a range of information. Maybe your address will come from statements you made on social media, plus e-commerce and pizza delivery, so someone will need to make an informed guess as to what your address is and with what confidence that address can be stated. So under self-sovereign identity, you control all access to that box. But of course, someone needs to be managing that box for you. It's not a physical box, it's in the cloud, so some provider needs to be managing that data. Who manages your data and how? Imagine a provider that has a ledger. So that set of boxes managed by a provider really is a history of information that have been submitted about each customer. We generally refer to such ledgers as the blockchain. In the case of Bitcoin, the blockchain is nothing more than a complete history of all transactions that have ever happened on Bitcoin, grouped into blocks for technical convenience. If I want to add a new transaction into the blockchain, transaction A, I want to send money to you, you will want to make sure that my money is good by checking where that money came from. I'll link the money that I'm transferring to you under transaction A to an earlier transaction B that shows you that I did have that money. But was B good money in the first place? Well, you need to check that B came from a valid transaction earlier in the blockchain and so on until you've accounted for the full history of that money. You would not accept my money under transaction A if you saw in the blockchain a transaction D that already claimed B as the source of the money. Money B is already claimed, it's already spent, so transaction A would be denied. That is the basics of the blockchain. It's a full record of all the transactions and information history. So the question is, who controls that ledger? And who can gain access to check information on that ledger? At one extreme, we have the centralized systems. One player has the ledger and decides who can check information in the ledger. One alternative is to distribute the database. So there's actually many copies of the database, but still it's private insofar as only a limited number of players are able to download a copy of the database and use it to check the validity of transactions or identities. At the other extreme, we have the public distributed ledger, which is available for download by all. Anyone can check information on it. But even if it's public and distributed, there's still the question of who validated the data. Who decided that transactions A, B, C, and D were going to enter the blockchain or not? One model is the permissioned public distributed ledger, where anybody can check information, but there's a reduced number of trusted actors who are controlling what gets added to the blockchain. In the case of identity information, for example, these trusted ledger actors would really want to be checking on two things. First, who is allowed to enter information? Going back to the previous slide, is Amazon going to be allowed to drop information into people's identity boxes or not? And that, of course, is a question of whether the trusted ledger actor trusts Amazon to enter real information. And secondly, once all that information is entered from various actors, how is a determination made as to what is the address of a particular user, and with what level of confidence do we know that address? Someone needs to be making these calls. Or do they? Because there's also permissionless systems, of which the Bitcoin is one, where there's no trusted authority at all. Everybody trusts the system, not any individual player. So the question is, under Bitcoin, how do those blocks get formed? Who decides what transactions are going to make it into the next block? And here's where you have the notion of miners, individual actors who've won the right to define the block by being the first to solve a computational challenge. So anybody can potentially be a miner and hence contribute to the blockchain. What is the relevance of all of this? Well, the starting point is to recognize that identity exposes many tensions between the singular and the plural, because I'm one person, but I'm actually many personas, between static and the dynamic, because I was a different person than I'm today, but also between the individual and the state, because often it's the state that is conferring the identity to me. And of course, an extreme form of that is the tension between the state and the stateless. New technologies are helping to deal with these tensions by making identity more flexible. Identity can be more diverse, allowing for different personas. It can be more decomposable because my identity is composed of a whole bunch of attributes about me, my citizenship, my age, my address, etc. It's more extensible because all these different bits of identifying information can be built into a data profile that then providers can use to target services towards me. And it can be more gradual, more probabilistic, with different levels of assurance based on the available information. And we saw two identity models that are vastly different in the rights that they confer and in the technology underpinnings, but they can coexist. That's the state-based identity system and the self-sovereign identity model, whereby an individual's identity is an irrevocable record under his or her own control. The idea of the identity locker, which I allow people to drop information into and allow people to extract information from.